Welcome yet again, everyone. This will be your lecture series for Chapter 8 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This lecture is entitled Securing the Republic, 1791 to 1815. The first section is Politics in the Age of Passion. The focus question for this section is, what issues made the politics of the 1790s so divisive? As you may have surmised by the focus question that began this section, the 1790s was a period of intense division, extreme hyperpartisanship, and extreme factionalism in American politics. Those positions that had been staked out during the ratification debates over the Constitution, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, hardened ever further during the 1790s into what would become the first political parties in the young republic. It's very important to understand that George Washington was elected the first president of the United States in 1788 unanimously. There was really no competition at all in this election. Washington was the only person that both sides of this hyper-partisan debate could agree upon. And this stability and consensus that Washington provided during this very unstable period played a large and indeed crucial role in keeping the young nation together. Really, without George Washington at the head of the country during this period, it is very unlikely that the American experiment would have lasted more than a decade or so. The partisanship that gripped the United States during this period was a reflection of the rivalry and the differences in political philosophy between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton was chosen as Secretary of the Treasury under the Washington administration, and he was the de facto leader of the Federalists. Again, the Federalists and their opponents, the Democratic Republicans, were not quite yet political parties as we understand them, but they were emerging and would evolve into such. Now, the Federalists during this period would be the conservative faction in American politics at the time. They envisioned a government molded after the government of Great Britain. They wanted to conserve that same sort of political tradition handed down to America by its former mother country, Great Britain. They were very much aristocratic by leaning in nature. They believed that society should be hierarchical and the elites should be at the top and they should be the ones that had political power. They believed that too much liberty equaled anarchy and was dangerous to the young republic. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was chosen as Secretary of State under the Washington administration. The fact that Washington put both these men in his administration reflected Washington's pragmatic nature and his willingness to work with both sides of the debates at all times to try to reach some sort of middle ground. Now, Jefferson was the de facto leader of the emerging Democratic Republican faction, which at this time would be the radical or liberal faction. They had this new vision of an ideal Republican society. They were very much leaning more towards the democratic nature of the ideals unleashed by the American Revolution. They believed that society should not be hierarchical, but should be more egalitarian, with limits on class and things of that nature. They believed that too much government equaled tyranny, the exact opposite of that position held by the Federalists. Each side actually had their own press outlets at this time. The Federalists had the Gazette of the United States, and the Democratic Republicans had the National Gazette. So essentially this was like the CNN and Fox News of its day. And I always find it very ironic when people speak about the hyperpartisanship and factionalism in our own modern politics and act like it's something new or unprecedented in American history, when really that sort of hyper-partisan, factionalist sentiment has been with the United States from the very beginning of the country. And really, the two positions that are outlined by Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans really represent the two fundamental opposing positions that have formed the bedrock of American politics from the beginning through to the present day. The debates between this idea of big versus small government have been perpetual in American society, and the compromises between those two positions really reflect the story of American politics over the course of its entire history. Another interesting and perhaps ironic note to point about these two gentlemen, Hamilton and Jefferson, is that the positions that they held were ironically not the positions that one would assume they would have held based on their upbringing and nature. Alexander Hamilton was born into poverty in the Caribbean. He was the bastard son born to a servant girl who some have speculated may have been of mixed race origin herself, making Hamilton himself perhaps at least part African American. He basically pulled himself up by his own bootstraps, immigrated to the United States as a young man, became the aide-de-camp, essentially the right-hand man to George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And so he was the perfect example of a self-made man. He kind of represented this American ideal of someone who was born into abject poverty but managed to rise up into the ranks. So the fact that he was very elitist in his outlook was very ironic considering where he came from. One would imagine that he would have been the more egalitarian proponent in this political debate at the time. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was born very wealthy in a well-to-do aristocratic Virginia planter family. So the fact that he supported the more egalitarian position of the common man was very ironic considering his background and where he came from. And both of these positions really kind of reflected the conundrum of American politics at the time and the unpredictability of the positions that certain people held and why they held them. Although the groundwork for the division between the Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian political philosophies was really laid during those constitutional ratification debates, the division really went into overdrive early in Washington's presidency over Hamilton's financial program. Hamilton had this vision of the United States as a world military and commercial power that was able to compete toe-to-toe and head-to-head with European states. He had a 5-part plan. The first was to establish United States credit worthiness on the world stage, and a part of that process was that he proposed the federal government should pay off all national as well as assume and pay off all state debt. That would not only help the United States credit worthiness on the global stage, but assuming and paying off that state debt would help make the states more subservient to the stronger central government, another key aspect of Hamiltonian political philosophy. He also wanted to create a national debt, have investors invest in the new federal government that would give them a stake in the success of that federal government. He thought that was essential for the growing commercial and political power in the young republic. He He also proposed the creation of the first Bank of the United States that could centralize financial authority in one federally controlled institution. Ironically, however, the Bank of the United States would actually be and was a private corporation, not directly tied to the federal government per se, but an associate of the federal government that could act in tandem as well as independently in matters of financial affairs. He also proposed a tax on whiskey to raise federal revenues. And he proposed protective tariffs and government subsidies to emerging domestic industries that would promote national economic development, a key aspect of his vision of the United States as a strong commercial power. Hamilton's economic plan was vehemently opposed by Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson and, by this time, Madison, who had realigned himself with Jefferson. Remember, originally he was more on the Federalist camp. He was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. But by this time, he had become concerned about the extent to which Hamilton wanted to push the centralization of the American government. These two gentlemen in particular saw the economic future of the country in westward expansion, in small, independent farmers, not trade and competition with Europe. They felt that that would be almost a suicidal mission on the part of America to try, especially at this early stage in its development, to compete with Europe on the world stage. Hamilton's plan, they felt, too much strongly favored the elites, particularly northern bankers and business leaders, while ignoring the plight and the needs of the common, average, everyday American. Jeffersonian ideal saw the nation as a republic of economically independent farmers, not a powerful central government with a class of commercial capitalists engaged in global economic affairs. Despite being so far apart in their vision for what the United States government should be, Hamilton and Jefferson were able to reach a compromise, a bargain on these issues. They've reached a deal whereby Southerners, who were typically the most vocal in opposition to Hamilton's programs, accepted those programs, that 5-point plan, in exchange for establishing the permanent capital for the United States on the Potomac River, what will become Washington, D.C. One of the Southerners' great concerns was the fact that up until this point the capital had been either Philadelphia or New York, which put it in the northern territories, and the Southerners felt that there needed to be a more neutral position for the United States capital so that it could not be overly influenced by either region's particular interests. The division between the Federalist and Democratic Republican camps at this time was further exacerbated by the advent of the French Revolution in Europe. It's very important to note that the French Revolution was directly inspired by the success of the American Revolution. The French felt that the American success showed that perhaps the Enlightenment principles that the French had a very big role in developing during that Enlightenment era can be successfully applied to European society as well. And the French Revolution further divided Americans between those who, like Jefferson, felt that the French Revolution was a triumph of democracy and popular government, and those like Hamilton who felt that the French Revolution, which very quickly descended into the reign of terror and all the beheadings and mobs running rampant through the streets and the violence and oppression of political opponents, to folks like Hamilton, that represented the tragedy of mob rule, of democracy gone too far, of anarchy. further exacerbating these tensions was Washington declaring neutrality between the war between Britain and revolutionary France that quickly broke out after the French revolutionaries took control of the French government. To the Democratic Republicans, this neutrality was a betrayal of their French allies who had helped so much during the American Revolution. The Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, felt that Americans owed it to the French to help them in their revolutionary cause, in no small part not only because the French were our allies, but because the French Revolution they felt was a continuation of the American Revolution, and the spread of those ideals that embodied the American Revolution back across the ocean into Europe and hopefully throughout the rest of the world eventually as well. Further stoking these tensions even more was Jay's Treaty in 1794. This treaty stemmed from first British impressment of American sailors into the British Navy to help it combat France during the war between Britain and France in the 1790s. Britain claimed that these sailors they were impressing from these American ships were actually AWOL British sailors, which was true in a handful of cases, but generally not true at all. And this issue of British impressment of American sailors very nearly brought the United States to war with Britain, yet again, merely a decade after the first American war with Great Britain. John Jay was sent to Britain by the Washington administration to try to negotiate a deal to end this practice by the British government. And the treaty that emerged from it was not satisfactory to any of the parties involved on the American side. Britain did, at least on paper, agree to give up its forts on the western frontier, many which still existed even after the American Revolution. And this was something that Britain was very slow to actually accomplish, if they actually did at all. U.S. also gave Britain favored nation trading status, cementing a commercial partnership with Great Britain at the time. Now, ironically, he was not able to reach any deal on the fundamental issue that sent him there in the first place, which was the impressment of American sailors into the British Navy. So many viewed, especially from that aspect, the treaty as an abject failure. But even more than that, the treaty effectively canceled the American-French alliance and set up an American-British alliance, which very much pleased the Hamiltonians and the Federalists, who were typically more ideologically and philosophically aligned with Britain anyway, but it certainly did not appease the Jeffersonian, the Democratic Republicans, who felt the treaty was scandalous, that it was an alliance with the enemy, and that it again was abandoning the French allies that had helped the United States so much during its own revolutionary struggle. In the midst of all this hyper-partisan wrangling over things like Hamilton's economic program and the intense divisions ideologically caused in the American public from the debates over the French Revolution, the Whiskey Rebellion occurred in 1794. This was the first true big test of the power and the authority of the federal government to quell domestic insurrection. The Whiskey Rebellion stemmed from that whiskey tax that Hamilton had put into place as part of his 5-part plan. Backcountry farmers in Pennsylvania blocked the collection of this new whiskey tax. Now, whiskey for these farmers, particularly those further away from the commercial centers, was a more economical way to preserve and profit from their crops. It was very difficult to send raw agricultural products across long distances to market without it spoiling first. So by distilling it into whiskey, it could, in theory, last forever and thus ensure the maximization of the profits from the crops that these farmers grew. They felt the tax unfairly targeted their main source of income. So they rose up in protest against the new whiskey tax. And like Shays' rebellion before it, it seemed to confirm Federalist fears of democracy, of that spirit of liberty unleashed by the American Revolution run rampant. And it raised new questions on whether the federal government could effectively deal with dissent and revolt. Washington personally led an army to put down the rebellion. He wanted to restore order, to prove to the nation and to the world that self-government could work and would not quickly disintegrate into anarchy and chaos. And thankfully, much like Shays' rebellion before, the appearance of this army led by Washington into Pennsylvania basically put the brakes on the rebellion. There was no violence or bloodshed involved. The rebels essentially backed down in the face of armed resistance, and Washington was successful in staking out the position that the federal government did have the authority and could put forth that authority in effectively dealing with such issues in the future. As the debates between these two ideologically opposed positions in American politics grew in the 1790s, so too did the public sphere grow concurrently with it. Now, each side of this debate felt that they were the true defenders of American liberty and the principles of the Revolution. The Federalists denounced Democratic Republicans as anarchists and traitors. Democratic Republicans denounced Federalists as monarchists, as desiring a king. Each party saw the other as an illegitimate faction that undermined American government. This hyper-partisanship, again, expanded that public sphere and the democratic aspects of American freedom. More and more citizens attended political events, read newspapers, and organized meetings as these debates grew ever more intense and fierce. There was this time saw the formation of democratic Republican societies, the first private political clubs in the young republic. The folks who formed such societies believed that involvement in public affairs was an essential part of political liberty, and that this political liberty was not merely in the act of voting, but also in the act of public debate over political issues, and the public actually being able to influence government in one way or the other on the political issues of the day. The Federalists denounced such clubs as usurping the authority of the government itself and essentially being some sort of extra-legal government entity of its own that sought to unduly influence the government. But again, the opinion of those who favored these sorts of societies was the exact opposite, that it was the duty of citizens in a republic to organize, to meet, to influence the government that supposedly held their interests closest to heart. The period of the 1790s also saw an intensification of the debate surrounding the roles and the rights of women in American society. In this period, a British woman by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft wrote perhaps the first feminist diatribe or treatise in the history of modern Western civilization in a vindication of the rights of woman, which called for greater access to education and paid employment for women, and that essentially women should have all of the same fundamental rights as men. A very radical position to stake out during this period. Increasing numbers of women put their thoughts into print in the 1790s and participated in political culture, even amongst like the democratic Republican societies that we spoke about in that last slide. There was also, on the American side of the pond, the authorship of On the Equality of the Sexes by Judith Sargent Murray, who argued against this idea of the inherent mental inferiority of women and said that that was not due to any sort of inherent nature, but rather was due to the lack of access to education. Now, the time was not yet right for a broad assault on gender inequality, but the public discussions of women's status and of women's rights helped to further popularize the language of rights in the new republic, which would have intense and dramatically shifting implications in the next century. Well, that was certainly a long one, but that does finally conclude the first part of our Chapter 8 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.